So, as most of you know, a series of attacks were conducted last Friday against my hometown of Paris, France. Uh, at the last count, 129 people were left dead, with a further 352 that were wounded, many of them critically. At least 8 attackers used grenades, suicide vests, shotguns, and automatic Kalashnikov type rifles to strike inside a packed music venue, a cafe, a restaurant, and outside the National Soccer Stadium during a match. 7 of the 8 attackers that we know about blew themselves up with suicide vests rather than risk capture. The men were heard praising Allah during the attacks, and subsequently the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, took responsibility for the attacks as retribution for recent French air raids against ISIS forces in Syria, which were conducted as a part of a joint air offensive with the United States and Turkey against ISIS. Now, as of right now, a manhunt seems to be underway for accomplices, and the French president has declared war on ISIS and proceeded to bomb its apparent capital in Raqqa, which is in Syria. Now, I thought I'd take the opportunity to talk a little bit about this because many of you probably have some questions. The media has certainly been awash with speculation about the causes and consequences of this sort of act. Some of you, like me, may have friends and family that were around or near or in these events. I want to take a minute to address some of these questions as best as I can, all the while acknowledging that there is much yet that we don't know about what's going on. Some of these questions are about the Middle East, but others concern European politics and American politics. Uh, Still, I don't think it's possible to formulate an opinion or even a coherent response about these sort of events without some knowledge of what's been going on. So, let me address a few of these questions. I realize there's probably more that you have, and you're welcome to get in touch with me if you do, but let me address at least a couple of them. First, what is ISIS? Well, ISIS is an armed group attempting to establish the workings of a state over northern Iraq and Syria. Officially, they claim an Islamist ideology to legitimize much of their conquest, and they want to establish something like a modern day caliphate. You'll remember that the caliphate was the combination of religious and secular authorities that characterized Muslim empires in the aftermath of the Rashidun period. The first caliph was Abu Bakr, and of course, the leader of ISIS has taken on that name, Abu Bakr. Now, in practice, many of their top level recruits are actually operatives from the former Ba'ath Party in Iraq, the secular socialist party of Iraq, that was led by Saddam Hussein. Uh, and these operatives have found a new employer that will hopefully, well, for them, make use of their skill sets in waging war, gathering intelligence, and administrating territory. Because it has seized oil field and also has had quite a bit of success in taking hostages for ransom, ISIS is probably better at paying its soldiers and its operatives than the Iraqi state ever was when it controlled the same territory. And because of their successes, many other radical Islamist groups have rallied to the banner of ISIS, for example, in Libya. And even some lone gunmen have claimed to be inspired by ISIS and attacked targets in North America and Europe. Now, right now, it's unclear whether all of these offshoots of ISIS are controlled by the same people or not, whether there's centralized control over ISIS or whether these are merely copycats who maintain loose ideological affiliation but don't otherwise have much to do with ISIS in Syria and Iraq. So, another question that we might ask is whether ISIS is simply the new Al Qaeda, right? The new incarnation of international Islamic terrorism. And I think there's reasons to, all the similarities, I think there's reasons to distinguish between ISIS and Al Qaeda. Now, Al Qaeda was a network with a very specific religious mission. Al Qaeda in Yemen, which sponsored the attacks in January 2015 against French magazine Charlie Hebdo, which is a French cartoon magazine which lampooned religion in general and Islam as well. In that attack, Al Qaeda was careful, or Al Qaeda operatives were careful to only kill individuals they considered responsible, cartoonists, military police, but they explicitly did not shoot women and children who were not um, actively opposing them. And so, in that sense, Al-Qaeda was fairly restrained. Al-Qaeda is, of course, known for attacking targets of symbolic, political, and military importance, the USS Cole, the Twin Towers. They have actually pulled back from the intentional targeting of civilians after 9/11 because 9/11 caused such a backlash even for them. So officially, 9/11 was a strike at the financial backers of what they saw as foreign invasion of the Middle East, and therefore they saw it as kind of a legitimate military target, as undercutting the financial wherewithal to wage war on them. But the collateral damage was so widely condemned in the Muslim world that Al-Qaeda even found it hard to elicit much sympathy after that. And so since then, they have been much more restrained in their targeting, if you can call it that. ISIS, by contrast, isn't so discriminating in their targeting. They're probably better understood as a political organization or revolutionary organization that uses religion as cover for their activities. Indeed, many of their activities seem to concern making money. So now, in fairness, to run a state and to run a terrorist organization requires money, but a lot of their activities seem like they're primarily aimed at making a lot of money. Certainly the hostage taking, where they requested recently $200 million from the Japanese government for the release of 2 hostages, and of course their oil sales are certainly funding a fairly sophisticated organization. Now, there's some similarities between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I think most people join Al-Qaeda and ISIS for similar reasons. A sense of moral outrage, certainly at the conditions of Sunni Muslims across the world, and especially at perceived attacks on people like them, right, by either Western army, pro-Western governments in the Middle East, or even Shia governments. Most recently the Shia government of al-Maliki in Iraq. So the moral outrage is not limited to violence against Iraqis or Palestinians, but also is aimed at the perceived economic domination of the West, which they see as a prime cause for the lack of jobs or opportunities for advancement for young Muslim men in the Middle East, as well as the racial and religious prejudice faced by Muslims who emigrate into Europe. And this is especially true in France, where unemployment rates among young Muslims are 3 to 4 times that of white French youths. Now, it's also worth noting that most Al-Qaeda and ISIS recruits don't really know very much about the Quran, and indeed many use drugs, alcohol, and visit prostitutes. ISIS, of course, is famous for mass rapes, beheadings, mass executions of non-Muslims. All of these things are explicitly prescribed by the Quran and condemned by it. And so, proscribed, right, not prescribed, right? So proscribed, forbidden. I should just use the word forbidden, right? They're explicitly forbidden by the Quran. Okay, so one more question one might ask is, why don't more Muslims across the world condemn ISIS? Right? I hear this a lot in the American media, especially, why are Muslims so silent about these episodes of violence? And the short answer is that they're not silent. The short answer is that ISIS is pretty remarkable at having pretty much united the entire Muslim community against itself. So, but I still think there's this strange fear in the West that even when Muslims express sympathy with Westerners over tragedies like the one that just occurred in Paris or 9/11, that Muslims at some level really do sympathize with the terrorists. And I think there's not much truth to that, or at least we have to be careful in how we describe quote-unquote sympathy. In the case of ISIS, almost all Muslims, including many Islamists, so even many radical Muslims, condemn ISIS, and have done so long before the Paris attack. So let me give you some examples, and I'm reading here. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which brings together 57 countries, says that ISIS has nothing to do with Islam. The Islamic Society of North America said that ISIS actions are in no way representative of what Islam actually teaches. Al-Azhar, the university in Cairo, which is the most prestigious center of Sunni Muslim scholarship, says that ISIS is acting under the guise of this holy religion in an attempt to export their false Islam. And even Saudi Arabia's Grand Mufti, who is a Salafist, so by many measures you would argue that he's more quote-unquote fundamentalist than most Muslims. The Grand Mufti Abdulaziz Al-Sheikh says that ISIS is the #1 enemy of Islam. So, It's hard to say that Muslims have not spoken up, including prominent Muslims and associations of Muslims have spoken up and very clearly said that nothing that ISIS does really can be plausibly done in the name of Islam. Um, in September 2014, so over a year before the Paris attacks, more than 120 Islamic scholars co-signed an 18-page open letter to Baghdadi, who is the self-styled caliph of the Islamic State. This is written in Arabic and basically ended up being a point-by-point criticism of ISIS's actions and its ideology based on the Quran and the classical religious texts, basically trying to debunk the idea that any of this is justifiable by reference to the Quran. So Muslims seem to have pretty much universally condemned ISIS, which doesn't mean that many of them don't believe that the Muslim world has nothing to complain about, right? Many Muslims, probably most Muslims, do dislike Western invasions of the Middle East, as well as propping up dictatorships in the Middle East in order to secure a reliable flow of oil. Many of them probably do dislike the fact that Western companies have a lot of economic influence, even in the Middle East. Probably almost no Muslims approve of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians in the West Bank or in Gaza. And all of them almost certainly object to the racism and religious prejudice faced by Muslims in France, Germany, and Eastern Europe as they go about looking for jobs and otherwise integrating into ordinary European life. Okay, why did ISIS attack France and not Germany or the UK or Russia? Well, the short answer is that, well, the UK and Russia have already been targeted for their involvement in the Middle East by ISIS and other groups. Certainly, Russia and south of Russia has a lot of Muslims and faces a pretty regular flow of, or at least faces a pretty regular challenge at controlling the flow of terrorists. There were bombings in Moscow a few years ago, not by ISIS, but just to note that attacks on all of these countries have almost always occurred. Germany perhaps is the only exception here because, well, maybe Germany doesn't send that many troops overseas and doesn't bomb countries in the Middle East, and so they don't face as much retaliation as countries like France and Russia and the UK. It's also worth noting that another reason why France is targeted is that France has up to 5 to 6 million Muslims, which is about 10% of the population. These Muslims primarily hail from North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Many of them feel marginalized from society and have few prospects in a very difficult labor market overall, even for non-Muslims. Many of these are economically constrained to live in projects outside major cities where the crime is common and where the police are fairly scarce. What else? So these conditions creates a kind of pool for recruits for radical Islamic clerics, and it's not surprising, therefore, that an estimated 500 French youths have gone to Syria to fight for ISIS, which is the largest number from any Western country. One issue is that these youths often are French citizens. They have French passports. They're second generation. Their parents or their grandparents immigrated from North Africa, but they themselves have French passports, which makes it very easy for them to enter the European Union and travel within the European Union with only a minimum amount of scrutiny. They don't get stopped very often. And of course, going to Syria is not like you get a stamp on the way in from a customs official that then the French authorities can look at when you come back in or whatever border you cross, and say, hey, you've been to Syria, maybe we need to pay attention to you. No, I mean, these people slip through the border, either through Turkey or other places, or by sea sometimes through Lebanon. The point is that these fighters, it's not known that they've been, and because they have French passports, they are completely free to move around Europe as they wish. The scary thing, of course, and one of the things that's been noted during the Paris attacks is that these youths can go to Syria, get a bunch of training in weapons and explosives and military tactics, and then they can come back. And when they come back, they can do a lot of damage. And again, because they come back often unnoticed, this can be extremely dangerous. And some of these people were indeed off the radar of the French government. Some of them were on the radar, and some of them weren't. But either way, it makes it very, very difficult and very scary. What else? One thing about the European Union is common market, which means, right, that within the European Union countries, so France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and a lot more countries besides. Between all these countries, there are no formal borders, and economically speaking, goods can transit wherever you like. So if a shipment of arms, for example, can make it across the border in any of these countries, then those arms are basically going to go wherever they want to go from there. So if a shipment from of AK-47s can make its way across the border from, say, Serbia into the Czech Republic or into Italy or into any or Slovenia, and then work its way from Serbia through Slovenia through Germany to France, it's very, very easy once you get across the border into any European country to go to any other European country. And so the European Union is only as secure as the weakest of its borders. And the weakest of the borders typically are in the east. A lot of the weapons are coming from Eastern Europe. Some of them are coming from the Balkans, where the rate of firearms ownership is very, very high still after the Civil War there in the early 1990s. But of course, Russia as well is a great source of weapons. And again, as long as you can get across one of the borders, the weakest of the borders, you can get across any of the borders. So despite France's very strict gun control laws, there are a lot of weapons circulating in France, particularly through criminal organizations. Okay, so in addition to this pool of angry youths, and in addition to the ready supply of smuggled weapons, it's also true that French governments have done some things to anger ISIS sympathizers and ISIS itself, because after it initially opposed the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the French government more recently has become more involved in the Syrian crisis. France has fairly strong historical ties to Lebanon and Syria, which creates some political pressure domestically to intervene in the affairs of those countries. France maintains a certain amount of missionary activities in Syria and Lebanon. Many of the elites there are French-speaking and have been educated in France and have relatives in France. And so as a result, the ties there are much deeper than with Iraq or other parts of the Middle East. So France has intervened in the fight against ISIS, has been bombing ISIS from the air for a while. And so there's definitely a way in which you can see this past week's bombings in Paris as retaliation for air raids conducted by France in Syria over the past few months. Okay, another question one might ask is, does ISIS have a strategy here? Why would ISIS make French resolve stronger by targeting civilians indiscriminately in such a way? Well, this is where we enter into the realm of speculation. I have to say that I don't know that my opinion is any better than anyone else's on this particular subject, but perhaps by stoking fear of Islam and the public's inability to distinguish between ordinary Islam on the one hand and Islamism on the other, ISIS is hoping to spark a repression in France, right? A crackdown on Muslims in France. And elsewhere in Europe, which then would have the effect of radicalizing young Muslims who right now might be on the fence, and even sparking more riots and even perhaps a low-grade sort of civil war in France. We've seen waves of riots in France before. A couple summers ago, youths went kind of on a rampage protesting unemployment and protesting discrimination. They set fire to cars and trash cans and basically made a huge mess and caused a huge crackdown. You could see a lot more of that. And of course, if that does occur, then we'll see another crackdown by the French government. We may see a further radicalization of some French youths, and certainly the French government's attention will be distracted from Syria, no question about it. In effect, I think the idea might be that to turn France into a kind of Israel, where security is the number one thing. You see lots of discrimination against, those who aren't quote-unquote French, particularly against Muslims, and which could create, like I said, a kind of low-grade civil war, and or create a police state, which just gives more ammunition to the ISIS propaganda that suggests that the West ultimately is the enemy and is mistreating Muslims, which almost certainly would happen, or you'd see incidents of that happening if the French government did adopt that tactic. Another idea maybe was simply the idea of many terrorists, which is to try to weaken the resolve of their opponents by spreading fear among them. When we talked about the assassins earlier on in the semester, we said that political assassination is a way to strike fear in the hearts of elites, maybe even create disarray by cutting off important sources of knowledge and important sources of connections at the top. And so political terrorism and political assassination is a way of disrupting the enemy and maybe weakening their resolve. And in a democratic country, of course, the people rule. And so in order to strike at the head, so to speak, you have to strike at the people. And perhaps the idea was that the French would seek to negotiate and perhaps withdraw their support for efforts against ISIS if it was found that the French public as a whole could be targeted fairly easily by ISIS itself. So if the thought was to try to get France to negotiate a political settlement and maybe get France to encourage its allies like the United States and the UK to also negotiate a political settlement with ISIS, then the early returns of this strategy has backfired pretty spectacularly. It looks like the French government is very much ready to go to war with ISIS now, more than ever, and so it does not look like the attacks have resolved or have weakened the resolve of the French government or the French people. But of course, time will tell. It's still early. Okay, some more questions that people ask. Well, what's the link between these attacks and the refugee crisis in Europe and the Middle East? Well, the early evidence is that one of the attackers did in fact slip in among a flow of refugees fleeing the Syrian civil war, entered Europe via Greece, and then made his way to France from there through the European Union. What we know is that a little over 4 million people have, as of right now, registered as refugees with the United Nations from Syria, and that would be about 20% of the pre-conflict population of Syria. Now, add to that another 8 million in Syria who are considered internally displaced, that is to say they've been kicked out of their homes and are in Syria but not at home in Syria. And these may or may not add to the flow of refugees in the coming months and years. Now, international law requires every country to take in its fair share of refugees as resources permit. So this is not like immigration where it's totally at your discretion. International human rights law says you have to take people in who are fleeing political conflict, who would be killed, basically, if they were in their home country. So there's no real question that Europe and the United States will have to admit some refugees. But of course, not all of them have to come in at once, and the process of documenting and vetting these refugees will take months and sometimes years. And in the meantime, these refugees will be stuck in refugee camps, and as refugees, they will not usually have work permits. They may not even be permitted to mingle with the local population, and they will probably be subsisting on humanitarian aid for the duration of their processing. Few of these have arrived with any savings, and so conditions in these camps will not be pretty. It's pretty telling that very few refugees from Syria actually want to go to France. Many of them are going through France to try to get to Britain. That is to say, there's a huge refugee camp right now at Calais, which is the port at the northern tip of France, closest to Great Britain. And there's a huge refugee camp, people trying to apply to asylum in the UK. Many, of course, prefer Germany, and Germany has proven to be very generous with Syrian refugees, allowing almost a million, about 800,000 in Germany right now, which is a sizable chunk of the population. I mean, it's a very, very large number of people to assimilate. Of course, Germany is by far the strongest economy in Europe, and so has the best prospects for assimilating that number of people to the labor force. But, you know, although this attack is certainly likely to make countries more cautious as they vet refugees and as they engage in thorough background checks to try and figure out where these people are coming from and who they are, it would also likely cause them to invest a lot more resources in this vetting process, which already is backed up. I mean, if you apply for refugee status now, your application probably will take a year to process or more in the best case scenario, because Western countries simply have not devoted and do not have enough resources to do all the vetting necessary, and so it takes forever to do so. And so this has put a huge strain on the administrations and the bureaucracies in the area. So certainly what we'll probably see more investment of resources in conducting these background checks. It may also induce Europe to provide a lot more economic aid, right? So even if the expertise needed to vet all these folks isn't immediately available, what European governments do have is money. And what they can do is provide more resources to the countries who are taking the majority of the refugees. These are Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, where the vast majority of Syrian refugees currently are. Certainly, making those refugee camps more pleasant is a way of stopping or preventing those refugees from trying to risk their lives to get to Europe. Because in many cases they'll be taking boats to Greece or to Italy, and those trips can be deadly. Uh, it's also worth noting that a vast majority of the refugees plan to return home, so these should not all be viewed, or even perhaps any of them should be viewed as permanent migrants. Some will probably stay, but many of them are conceive of themselves as temporarily displaced and will try to return as soon as conditions permit. So this should encourage us to view questions of refugees and questions of immigration as completely distinct, right? Allowing someone in as a refugee is a kind of temporary visitor pass, right? Until conditions in their home country improve. It's not necessarily a permanent arrangement, although of course when you look at the fate of Palestinian refugees from 1949 who still have not returned, the you can be a refugee for a very, very long time. And then over time, after years and years go by, questions about what to do with these people who manifestly are not going home, because in some cases home doesn't exist anymore, in the case of Palestine, then the question becomes much more acute. But for now, at least, the questions are pretty distinct. Okay, finally, and this is probably what you're most interested in, although probably what I can tell you the least about, is what can the United States and Europe do to combat ISIS? Well, in many ways, the Paris attack doesn't really give us a lot of new information. It was known for some time that ISIS was planning an attack on France. It was known that some small portion of refugees were likely terrorist plants from ISIS and other organizations. It was known that ISIS was a ruthless military organization that had no qualms about massacring civilians. So the strategy to defeat ISIS, whatever it is, hasn't changed because of the Paris attacks. Perhaps the motivations and the political willpower to defeat ISIS have increased, but the strategy, whatever it was before, is still the same. Defeating ISIS militarily and reclaiming control over northern Iraq and Syria will probably be easier than addressing the bitterness and resentment of a generation of young Muslims, both in the West and in the Middle East, who have very little status, few economic opportunities, and are treated fairly poorly by their own governments and foreign governments alike. Now, personally, I believe the best thing we can do is clearly keep in mind the line between radical Islamism and Islam. We can be against radical Islam and against political violence without being against Islam or Muslims more generally. And just because most of us can't really tell the difference doesn't mean we should go about living our lives in fear of Muslims or the Muslim world. After all, we can't really know what's in the heart of any person, and we still go about our lives on a daily basis. Very, very few Muslims are Islamists, and we can only really drive moderates into the arms of extremists by treating all Muslims as Islamists. That is to say, by securitizing and taking a hostile attitude towards Muslims more generally. We're not necessarily going to do much to help. Now, in closing, what I want to do is read a couple paragraphs from a letter that I received from my father this morning. My father lives in Paris, and he's been going through a lot of these events and a lot closer, obviously, to these events than I am. But this is a letter that he addressed to his friends and family in the United States, and I'm just going to read from it in closing. So, my father says, "We're aware that terrorist attacks in France were expected by reason of French participation in military operations in Africa and in Iraq and Syria, and to the relatively greater accessibility of France as compared with other participating countries. As well as no doubt the international news value of a strike in Paris, and it seems widely feared that more will be coming. As opposed to previous incidents in which the targets appeared predictably designated, like Charlie Hebdo, military police, Jewish institutions, etc., Friday's targets were indiscriminate, average Paris men and women living and enjoying their lives, which takes us back to the 1995 series of indiscriminate attacks by the Algerian GIA. The GIA is the Groupe Islamique Armé, or the Islamic Armed Group, which was the militant wing of the FIS, which was the major Islamic party an opposition party in Algeria during the dictatorship there. In 1995, there were actually a series of bombs in the French subways that exploded. And this was in protest of apparent French support for the authoritarian state in Algeria. Anyway, I'm going to continue. He continues, says it could have been worse. There was only a single victim of the soccer stadium, but however many victims, that this kind of thing can happen here and throughout the world is terribly sad. We now have to see how these attacks, and perhaps those to come, will affect the French political situation. Campaigning has already begun for the 2017 presidential elections, and security, immigration, asylum, and border controls will be even more major issues than already are. In France and throughout the European Union, not to mention increased de facto discrimination against Muslim citizens and residents, and in the case of France, forthcoming war operations in Syria and elsewhere, where predictable if unintended collateral damage to innocent civilians, although rarely referred to here, serves as an effective incitement to participate in pretended equivalent reprisals aimed equally at the innocent. All we can do is pray, pay our taxes, and keep our eyes open. However, we have no intention of changing the way we live, and we will see what comes next. Thank you for your much appreciated support, affectionately, and so on and so forth.